Good evening. Welcome to Luther College. Thanks everybody for joining us for this extremely timely, distinguished lecture. I'm Andy Hageman, professor of English and director of the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement, what we call the KEEP here at Luther. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome our special guests and to introduce this lecture series tonight. First, we begin with a land acknowledgement. The land on which Luther College stands has been home to the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota people and their ancestors. As part of the neutral ground created by the US government to control the movement, lives, and livelihood of Native peoples, this land was home to the Ho-Chunk during their forced displacement from Wisconsin. The dispossession of the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota, and the forced migration of the Ho-Chunk people was motivated by the interests of settlers such as those who founded this town and this college. The Ho-Chunk, during their residence here, addressed the land as grandmother. The tribe's orator, Wakan Dekora, believed his people were extended the blessing of this place by the Great Spirit, saying, quote, "We did not make it, nor could we make it, so pretty and fair a land." Please honor this history and the ongoing connection of the descendants of these early residents of this place. Please honor and care for the land, water, and life of this place as these residents have, like a loved and loving elder. Welcome to the 7th Dr. David J. Roslien Distinguished Lecture on Science and Leadership. The Roslien Distinguished Lecture honors Dr. Roslien for his 36 years of distinguished service to Luther College in his numerous roles as assistant, associate, and full professor of biology, dean of admissions and financial aid, vice president of college advancement, executive vice president of the college, and finally, as interim president. Dave devoted his entire career to his students and to Luther College. We're here to pay tribute to you, Dr. Roslien, by bringing nationally leading scientists, policymakers, and other experts to Luther, to expose students, faculty, staff, and the larger community to great science and policy issues and challenges that face our world today. Dr. Roslien, while this special lectureship honors your legacy, the many hundreds of Luther students whose lives you've indelibly shaped is a legacy that will thrive forever. Success is often also grounded in deep family support. So Joy Roslien and other members of the Roslien family in attendance, this lecture is also in your honor. Would Dave and Joy and other members of the Roslien family in attendance please stand? Previous Roslien Distinguished Lectures have featured the pioneer climate scientist James Hansen, internationally renowned journalist Ted Koppel, Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank President Neil Kashkari, and former CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky. Tonight we add to this list of eminent thinkers and world shapers Dr. Michael Osterholm. Also on stage to host Dr. Osterholm in a fireside chat format, Dr. Mark V. Larson. After graduating from Luther in 1978 and medical school at the University of Iowa, Dr. Larson completed a residency in internal medicine and fellowship in gastroenterology at Mayo Clinic. Since 1989, he's been a consultant in gastroenterology at the Mayo Clinic, specializing in interventional endoscopy and malignant and pre-malignant gastrointestinal conditions and syndromes. He remains deeply engaged in medical research and educational activities, and has also held a number of administrative positions, currently serving as medical director of the Mayo Clinic Care Network, which is a collection of domestic and international organizations that work collaboratively with Mayo Clinic. Here at Luther College, we also think of Dr. Larson as a wonderful alum who generously supports the institution with his time and talents, including as a regent on the Luther board. Michael Osterholm, PhD, MPH, is Regents Professor, McKnight Presidential Endowed Chair in Public Health, the Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, called CIDRAP, Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences, School of Public Health, a Professor in the Technological Leadership Institute, College of Science and Engineering, and an Adjunct Professor in the Medical School, all at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Osterholm is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the Council of Foreign Relations. In June 2005, Dr. Osterholm was appointed by Michael Levitt, Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, to the then newly established National Science Advisory Board on Biosecurity. In October 2008, he was appointed to the World Economic Forum Working Group on Pandemics. Dr. Osterholm has written more than 420 papers and abstracts and multiple best-selling books, including his most recent title, The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. And like Dr. Larson, Dr. Osterholm is a Luther graduate who also generously supports the college in many ways, including as a regent and tonight by delivering this lecture, Public Health in Crisis, What This Means to You. Finally, a quick word on how the evening will proceed. So the fireside chat will run for approximately an hour, and then the two doctors will open the floor for a public Q&A. We've got 2 microphones stationed there. If you would like to ask a question at that time, please queue up behind the microphones. And as a friendly reminder, please keep your questions concise, constructive, and civil. We would appreciate that. After the lecture, Dr. Osterholm will be out in the CFL lobby for a brief book sale and signing if you want to say hi and grab your copy of that latest book. Now please join me in a warm Luther College and Decorah, Iowa welcome to Drs. Mark Larson and Michael Osterholm.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, and welcome. I think we're going to have a really interesting, stimulating, in-depth conversation with this guy tonight. We've got lots to talk about, lots. We're going to focus on the status of public health. Like the title said, that Andy just relayed, is it in crisis? How did we get here? And what are we going to do about it? What do we have to do to address that? So we're going to look at public health as an outline in 3 different lenses. The first lens will be historical, the past. The second lens will look at public health from what happened during the pandemic. And then the third lens will be, now what are we going to do? Where do we go from here? As Andy said, this is supposed to be a fireside chat. Nice digs for a fireside room, but what's good about a fireside chat is it's unscripted. So Mike and I haven't rehearsed. He doesn't know the questions. So I'm going to ask him tons of things. And then when I'm done, it's your turn. Your turn to ask, arguably, the preeminent infectious disease epidemiologist on the planet. Those questions that you've been wondering about for these last 6 years. But before we begin, we want to add to what Andy said and reflect on why we're here tonight, who we're honoring, Dr. David Roslien. So Dr. Roslien, for Mike and I, who had him as a professor and a teacher and a mentor and a campus leader, left a great impact on so many of us, legacy of Luther students, faculty, staff, and the community as well. So again, I want to give my thanks to Dr. Roslien and this honor for him tonight. Now it's Mike's turn.
Well, first of all, Mark, thank you very much for doing this and for being part of this. I do trust your questions. You won't let me drown. I'd like to start out with a story that I think explains tonight in ways that I could never otherwise do. I was born and raised in Waukon, not far from here. I was raised in a family, the oldest of 6 kids. I had a father who was an alcoholic and a very violent, mentally ill man. And I came home from my football game in October, my senior year of high school, and I'd found my father had taken a broken beer bottle to my mother, and I found her in the kitchen floor, and I thought she was dead. And the first time in my life I ever physically responded, in which I physically kicked my father out of the house, and he never returned again. So from that period on, my mother was raising 6 kids, literally not having enough food on the table. And I'm now a senior in high school trying to figure out what my life is all about, where it's going, knowing that I really needed to stay home and help out. It also had some impact on me that my high school guidance counselor told me I wasn't college material and that I would best stay and walk on, and there were several jobs that would be open that I might qualify for. And fortunately, I, as a junior in high school, had known my love of infectious disease and infectious disease research work, had gotten to know Dr. David Roslien through a third party. And Doc, even in my days of high school, helped me with a study I was doing on salmonella in the Upper River. And I soon became very, very fond of him and Joy. But now, fast forward to the end of my senior year of high school, I had no idea what I was going to do. I thought maybe my life would be, in fact, that staying and walk on, which surely could be a good life. And so I borrowed a car from a neighbor and drove to Decorah on May 9th of 1971. I can tell you the date and time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I arrived at Rosalien's, asked if I could have a few minutes with Doc, and I sat on their front porch, crying my heart out, afraid, scared, and lonely about what was I going to do? Who could I be? And Doc, without thinking twice, said to me, he said, "You're going to go to Luther." I said, "I can't afford Luther, you know that, I can't. We can make this work." This was Sunday. By the following Friday, I had a letter of acceptance to Luther College with a academic and financial package that was remarkable, and even enough work study so that I could send money home to my mother. That man literally changed my life in a way that no one else has ever done. That's the Doc Roslien I know. That's the Dave Roslien, the Joy Roslien combination that has impacted so many people. So we can sit up here tonight and give accolades about accomplishments academia-wise or whatever, but it was a man who said to me, "You're going to go to Luther College," and had the faith in me to do that. Doc and Joy, I not only love you, but I owe you everything. Thank you. And let me just add one other comment tonight before Mark starts, because this comes up fairly often. Tonight I will be very pointed in my comments. They will be what I call my tradition of balls and strikes, and calling balls and strikes. I've had a role in every presidential administration dating back to Ronald Reagan, where I worked on the HIV/AIDS Commission. And when looking at the first Trump administration, I was a science envoy for the State Department. Most recently on the COVID transition team for the Biden administration. When I was at the State Health Department for 25 of my first 50 years, and I was at the university and the State Health Department together during those first 25, I worked for 2 Democratic governors, 2 Republican governors, and 1 independent wrestler. And I can tell you that no one knew my partisan politics. My job was to call balls and strikes. Tonight, some of my comments may hit hard, but there'll be balls and strike calls, and I will continue to do that. We are in a dangerous time as it relates to public health, as it relates to many issues in the world. So please take my comments that way. They're not partisan. They're balls and strikes.
All right, Mike. We said at the start, our first lens of perspective is going to be looking at historical information. So, the health of the public, we've thought about for centuries and centuries. There was bubonic plague, there was smallpox when this country was founded, polio, TB, HIV, you name it. You know, when you think about all of this together, they're basically just bugs. These are microbes. These are single cellular things like bacteria or even smaller things like viruses. Just for the audience's sake, put this into perspective. Of all the world's events, where do infectious diseases rank?
Well, first of all, the number one cause of death in humans dating back to the caves has been infectious diseases, and it remains so today when you look at the worldwide issues. And to give you some idea of the impact of infectious diseases, take a look no further than smallpox. Smallpox is a disease that we eradicated from the world in humans by 1978. By eradicated, I mean there was no one else left that had it, and there was no animal role at all. And so we could say it was done and gone. Today it only exists in several laboratories, which are of concern, but it's there. If you look at the 20th century, from 1900 until 1976 when it was eradicated, it was out of most of the world by the 1940s. It was only low-income countries, really, that we had the challenges in the 50s and the 60s before we eradicated it. And despite that fact, smallpox killed over 250 million people in the 20th century. Over 250 million people when it was almost not here. If you look at the flip side of that in infectious diseases, and we're going to talk a lot about this tonight, if you look at what vaccines have done, there is no other medical intervention that comes close to what vaccines have done for us. If you look at the last 50 years with really good data, every 1 minute, 6 people in this world are saved from dying because they were vaccinated. Think about that, every minute. It turns out that over 160 million people are alive today because they didn't die from a vaccine-preventable disease because they got a vaccine. That gives you ideas of the orders of scope and what this is all about. You know, the late Josh Lederberg, Nobel Prize laureate, very well known in the infectious disease world, once said, "The bugs were here before us, they're here while we're here, and they're going to be here long after we're gone." And that's a reality we have to deal with. So today, when I look at the potential for catastrophic events around the world, I realize that there are many different reasons why they could occur and do occur, some which surely have nothing to do with science. But when you look at the actual cause and realize infectious diseases and the role they play, it is remarkable. And then on top of that, one of the things, and Mark knows this from his own work, is that if they don't kill you, they still may cause you a lot of harm. And we see more and more chronic health conditions today that we can actually relate to post-infection related challenges. And so I think it's fair to say, unlike what happened to me when I graduated from Luther, where I was told, why were you going into infectious diseases in 1975? It's a horse and buggy. It's hardly that. And unfortunately, it's making a major resurgence for a lot of different reasons, which we'll talk about tonight.
You know, Mike, in 1918, there was a flu pandemic that you're very much aware of and you've studied. You know, the world was a very different place back then. You know, there weren't airplanes that took people from continent to continent. There were no vaccines. What did you learn from that pandemic that helped to shape the evolution of public health in the United States? What did we learn from that early pandemic, even though it was a very different world at that time?
Well, ironically, the thing that I learned wasn't part of what you'd call the main pandemic. John Barry, who wrote the historic novel of the 1918 pandemic, actually describes very nicely what happened in 1920, 21, 22, and 23, which was literally 1918 wasn't even the worst of the pandemic in much of the world. It was 1919 and 1920. And guess what happened? As the pandemic wound down, there was this major surge of isolationism, conservatism, and what many would say basically was a very fractionated government, as well as the world economy. And I really concentrated on that as we were talking about what could we in 2021 and 22 and 23 expect to be happening. And guess what? It's deja vu all over again. It's happening. And so in a sense, I'm not going to suggest that a pandemic will be cause and effect and will cause the world to have the challenges that it's currently having. But there are many parallels. And the reason I think that's important is because we surely have to get through what's happening now, but this should be part of our plan for the future. There will be more pandemics. Some could be much worse than COVID, much worse. What is it going to be like on the other side? And what can we do to better prepare ourselves for that now?
You know, Mike, you and I were both born in the 1950s when polio was epidemic. You know, just without getting to where we are right now, we'll talk about that later, talk about when vaccines came into place in the 20th century, when they started to appear, and just the public acceptance of vaccines. When the polio vaccine became available, when people lined up to get it, just the public acceptance and how the public felt about science and scientific breakthroughs. Just give us that perspective. Hold off on comments on vaccine concerns for a later subject, but give us that 20th century view of what Americans felt about vaccines and their acceptance of science at that time.
I'm chuckling here because he's a really good racehorse driver. He's holding back.
Hold back, hold back. I know where he wants to go.
You know, I think to put it in perspective, the year I was born, there were 55,000 cases of paralytic polio in this country. 21,000 individuals ended up in iron lungs. The year I was born. In my first grade class in Walk-On, one of my classmates in first grade died from measles. You know, back then, that was everyone's worst fear as a parent, is the summertime polio cases that would occur. Other than the COVID pandemic, the only time the state fair in Minnesota ever shut down was for a polio epidemic back in the 1950s. And so I think to put into perspective the fact that, you know, we don't see that now, but it's coming. And what I mean by that is, if I could just use the example of measles. Measles, which is a disease which can surely have major, major health implications. We can go into that later. But Canada has just gone through the last year with about 5,000 cases of measles. It has basically occurred because of the under-vaccination and increasing resistance to vaccination. Now, you can say, well, that's a lot. Well, remember, Canada has 40 million people. We have 340 million people. And we've looked carefully at the vaccination policies and the actual number of people vaccinated in this country and who are still yet vulnerable. And it's very similar to what Canada had 18 months ago. If, in fact, we were to see measles play out like it could, we could be talking about 45,000 cases of measles in this country a year. This is a country that eliminated measles. The term eliminated means it's out of our country, not out of the world, but out of our country. And so I think that what we have to understand is that they are going to come back. They will come back to get you. And our job is to somehow help shape the public policies, the belief systems, and the ability to communicate so that people understand that's the price they're going to pay if they don't address this issue. And I think that that's going to be our real challenge going forward, is how do we take the experience of the last 50 years and bring it back home today, because it's deja vu all over again.
And speaking of experience, in 2017, you wrote a book that became a New York Times bestseller. It was called Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs. Think of reading that before you go to bed. So Mike wrote this book in 2017. What happened a couple years later? Mike, in this book, he predicted the next pandemic. So tell us again, for this historical perspective, what was your message to the public health world and to Americans when you wrote that book? What was your message at that time? What did you want us to take away from your concerns?
Well, let me just tell you, if you're a friend of mine, you probably don't want me to ever talk about this, okay? It was interesting because I wrote a book in 2000 called, it was about living terrors, how to survive a coming bioterrorist catastrophe. And then literally 1 year later, I think of the 18 copies sold, I had bought 14 of them. And then, of course, 9/11 happened and anthrax, and it became a New York Times bestseller a year later, just like the other one did. And I hope that this one that I'm just published doesn't become a bestseller. I pray to God it doesn't. And I say that for my kids, because it points out that there are infectious agents out there. There are certain viruses that could be a lot worse than what we saw with COVID, or even what we've seen with flu. And we are not preparing for these at all. We are basically not only not preparing for them, but we're creating a false narrative that the vaccines for these are dangerous, which if you're a citizen saying, well, my government's telling me this vaccine's dangerous, why would I want to take it? You know, and so I think that the challenge we have today with trying to forecast the future is, one, everyone will assume you're a nut and that you're an alarmist. And at the same time, our job is to say, no, this is just like hurricane prediction. I'm not telling you you're going to get hit with a hurricane today, but I'm telling you hurricanes are going to hit these areas, and you can count on them. And when they do hit, are you ready for them? And that's what we have to think about with a pandemic. A pandemic is like that, is that it's going to happen, another one.
Mike, let's shift a bit and look at the lens of public health now through what actually happened with COVID. So 7 million deaths, biggest natural disaster in a century, tore at the fabric of society, global disruption in supply chain, the economy, school education systems like Luther College were markedly disrupted by that. Let's begin with this question. I would love to be Mike Osterholm in December of 19 or January of 20. What happens as an infectious disease epidemiologist when there's a sudden blip or a signal somewhere in the world that turns out to be a big deal? I mean, do you get a text message on your phone and it says, hey, Mike, something's happening in China? Or what's it like to be you when there's a sudden signal somewhere in the world that actually turns out to be a really big deal? How does this cascade happen in your world?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me clarify that a pandemic, as you've gone through with COVID, is a worldwide epidemic. It's hitting everybody. It may be more in one place, a given set of months, than another place, but it's hitting everybody. And we saw that even in 1918, where we didn't have airplane travel, and we still saw it move quickly around the world. Also, one of the real important features of a pandemic virus is that it spreads readily by the airborne route, meaning that if I had one tonight, I would be potentially nailing a number of you in this audience, because in fact, airborne transmission can go many, many feet from someone and actually infect them. The next time you're out somewhere and you still smell cigarette smoke and you see 40 feet up the sidewalk is somebody smoking, smoke is an aerosol. That's an example of what we're talking about with airborne transmission. So you got to have that part of it too. So it's not just any bug emerges. So ironically, I was very involved with the Wuhan discussions on December 29th and December 30th of the first weeks of this whole situation. We have an amazing team at our center at CIDRAP where we literally follow news around the world 24/7. We follow publications, and we put out for our staff every day most current what's happening. And we picked up on Wuhan right away. On December 30th, we published the first article on it, said something's happening. Well, if you look back, initially, I was actually somewhat feeling good about it because I thought initially it looked like influenza, which if this was an influenza virus killing people in Wuhan, we're in big trouble. This is a pandemic. But it turned out the first test results came back a coronavirus. Well, coronaviruses are basic causes of things like what's called SARS, which happened in 2003, which it was caused 8,000 cases and a number of deaths. But in fact, it was one that wasn't that infectious, and we could actually contain it. And we did contain it eventually. And so SARS was that way. Then along came MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And I might add, SARS came out of China out of a spillover from an animal population, no question about it. Then along comes MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which came from camels. And basically a human-camel area, very little human transmission, with rare exception. There was one outbreak in a hospital in Seoul, Korea, that actually I was very involved with working up, where there was some additional transmission. But in my mind, a coronavirus was not bad news because we could control it. Well, then by January 10th, 11 days later, it was clear this was not a regular coronavirus. We were seeing widespread transmission, not now longer just in China, but we were starting to pick it up in Hong Kong and where travel was moving and so forth. And so I put a statement out on January 20th of 2020 saying, get on with it, this is the next pandemic, this is COVID, and it's coming. And it still took us 2.5 months for the World Health Organization to declare a pandemic. So I think our group understood the implications of this coronavirus. We had lots of intelligence telling us that this was happening. And we also realized that there was a lot of misinformation. For example, in our country, we kept commenting about how we had fortified our West Coast and it wasn't going to come in, okay, making people feel like it's not going to happen. Meanwhile, cases were literally flowing out of China to Europe, and we had European cases now coming to the United States, and our East Coast was getting nailed, just nailed. I mean, we had to get freezer trucks for all the bodies those first months because we couldn't handle them all. And so I think that was the big experience, was getting people to believe that this was going to be a coronavirus pandemic and that it was going to be very bad, and that it would, literally it took us 2 months before as a country we finally came to that understanding, or for that matter, the world.
Mike, can you add on to that? Help the audience understand you've got a coronavirus, same thing as a common cold, but how does a virus mutate? How does it evolve? You said on CNN early on, stay tight, this thing could change, it could evolve, we're going to see different variants of this. Help the audience understand how a simple virus like that can become more virulent and the infectivity rate can climb. How does that happen?
Yeah, well, there's two parts to these viruses that become very important in terms of what a pandemic is like. One is how easily do they actually infect you, meaning what is airborne, what's not, what's respiratory transmission. And there are certain cells that allow the virus to attach to a human cell, in this case a lung cell, an upper respiratory cell, that then allows you to get infected. The second part, though, which is obviously very important, is does it kill you? Is there parts of the virus that will actually cause you to become seriously ill and die? And it's when you have the combination of both. And what was happening was we were seeing some changes, not much, but some changes in this very unique ability of this virus to connect to a human cell and cause infection. But what was really challenging was its ability to kill. And unfortunately, basically over time, we had what we called variants, where, as Mark was alluding to, the virus would mutate a little bit. We first had what we call the ancestral strain, then the alpha strain, then the beta strain, then the delta strain, then the Omicron strain. And each one of those was quite different in terms of how it killed and what it meant in terms of how long you were infected or infectious, et cetera. But it was all in that coronavirus family that was happening with. I only point this out because what MERS and SARS had was the ability to kill. SARS killed about 25% of the people that got infected with it. MERS killed up to 35% of the people. SARS-CoV-2, COVID, killed about 1.5% of people. Why is that an important number? Because now we have identified coronaviruses in bats in both South America and Asia that actually have the ability to be highly transmissible like SARS-CoV-2 or COVID, but kill like we saw with MERS and SARS itself. So imagine if our COVID pandemic had been a 35% case fatality rate, not a 1.5%. You know how bad things were with 1.5%. That's what we're up against today.
Yeah. Mike, those early days, you must have been 24/7 on this stuff. And, you're on CNN every night or other media activity, and you were the face of the public health world. What does that feel like when you're on CNN talking to the world about something really serious? I remember a quote you said one time, I think it was in March or April, look folks, we're in the second inning of a really long ball game. And the whole world reacts to that comment. So that weight on your shoulders to give that type of information, like you said a minute ago, you just call balls and strikes. What does that feel like to be the public face of the health system? How does that, what's the weight on your shoulders in that moment?
Well, I think, first of all, let me just say that, when you've been thinking about this over your whole career, or at least a large part of your career, what was going to happen, there was a lot less confusion for me. Many people would say, what's going on, and I could kind of see what was happening in a sense. But what was happening was a frustration that we did get it wrong. Public health had a lot of messaging challenges, they did. But it was not because anybody didn't try, or it was because people didn't care. People didn't understand. I wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post in early March of 2020 and said, whatever you don't do lockdowns, don't do them, they won't work. And they won't work because, are you prepared to handle this for 3 to 5 years? So many people went into this pandemic as like a hurricane where it was going to be really bad for 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, and then we go in recovery. And I'm sitting there saying, no, this is going to be 3 or 4 or 5 years. I was on Joe Rogan on March 10th of 2020, and I said at that time I thought there would be at least 800,000 deaths in the next 3 years, and that's when we only had a couple hundred deaths. And I got panned royally by my colleagues. I mean, here you go being scary. 18 months later, we hit 790,000 deaths in this country. It was hard to do that because people don't want to believe it. And even if you've had a track record of, basically calling balls and strikes, there's still a lot of personal emotion that goes into this and people not wanting to believe it could be like that. Yeah. And so I think that was a challenge. The second thing, though, that was a challenge was my family. And I can say I'm the most fortunate man in the world. My wife, Fern, got me through this pandemic in a way. I have all through my career had controversial positions, have challenged the norm on things, but I never had a death threat until COVID. And I never had somebody write to me and say, shut the F up, I know where your daughter works and your grandkids go to school. Mm-hmm. That sucks the guts out of you. So whatever's going on up here has to stay stable to make sure that this doesn't take over. That was the hard part in the panic around the whole issue of the pandemic for me, was really that emotional part.
That's quite remarkable. Mike, since you brought up mandates, if we put the spotlight on all the different aspects of public health that happened during the pandemic, mandates were certainly very controversial. And give us some insight, how does the public health system use modeling to help predict what's going to happen, what should shut down, what shouldn't shut down? You have to give information that governments and schools and travel industries and restaurants, they all rely on the public health system to give them the data, predictive data that can help them make the right decisions. How did the public health world, how do you use those models to do the right thing?
Well, virtually most all the models that were originally done were all wrong and occasionally gave you something interesting. And so that was a problem in of itself. Let me give you a good example. In the first year of the pandemic, when the Omicron, or when the Beta and Delta variants were present, we lost 199 kids in this country from COVID, 199. And people assumed that the risk wasn't that high for kids if you did the age adjustment and so forth. The problem was, in the next 2 years, we had over 1,559 cases and deaths in kids. Because when the virus changed, the risk to kids changed. Major change. So 87% of the deaths in COVID in kids occurred year 2 and 3, not year 1. And what we did is we made policy decisions based on what happened in year 1. And some of us were saying, you got to go back and revisit these. This is not the same situation it was in year 1. And we virtually had no one that was willing to do that. They stuck with, this is our policy. And so one of the challenges we had was using data to help understand. I would just use as an example for the vaccine, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but again, communication. I was very involved with the discussions that took place in the Biden administration when the new 2 vaccines came forward, the mRNA vaccines by the 2 companies. And this is in December now of 2020, and it's just remarkable that we have these, just absolutely miraculous. And we reported out, which was appropriately so, that at 2 months, there was about 95 to 97% protection. But I had worked a lot with the coronaviruses, having been part of the SARS response in 2003 and part of MERS in 2012 and 2015. And I was always struck by what was the waning immunity with this, meaning that I would get infected, I could have really good protection, but that over time it would wane, meaning that you lost protection. And the question I asked was, well, these vaccines are great right now. Boy, can I encourage everybody to get it, but will they be good in 6 months from now? And so I had actually urged at the time that we continue to follow these cohorts of people who were part of the studies that we used to determine how well they worked. So even though the people who hadn't been vaccinated that were compared to the people who had now gotten vaccinated, we could still say, what happens at 5 months? What happens at 7 months? Does it drop from 96 to 82 to 59? And we could have warned the public and said, you know what, we're in uncharted territory here. And remember, if you remember nothing from this talk tonight, just remember, science is not truth. It is not truth. It is the pursuit of truth. And we're always going to be pursuing that, and we're going to get better at it all the time. And what if we had told the public that you're going to need a booster at 6 months? Because guess what? It is waning. Well, what happened in the summer of 2021 in Barnstable, Cape Cod? A huge, huge festival ended up in hundreds of cases of COVID occurring in people who had been vaccinated 6 months before. And now they thought, you guys lied. You told me this vaccine was going to work. Nobody lied. It was best intention that it would stay at 97% protection, but it didn't. And that's why today you need to get your boosters. And let me just tell you, for everybody in this room, and there's a couple of you over 65 in here, I see that. That's good. By the way, I have a podcast where the average age of listeners is 94, so I get that. But we have more and more data showing that ongoing booster doses of COVID greatly reduces your likelihood of having serious illness, hospitalizations, or deaths. And you know what? I'll take that any day of the week. And so I think that's the challenge we're running into, is how to use this data and how to put it out there and how to communicate to the public. And we just didn't do a good job of that in many ways.
Speaking of data, Mike, I don't know how much data you have from all parts of the world, but there were so many different approaches by different governments. South Korea, China, they went with the lockdown approach. The Scandinavian countries had a very different approach, especially Sweden. Norway and Finland did it differently than Sweden did. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, in the U.S., there was red state, blue state differences. Give us your take on all the different mandates. Maybe start with South Korea and China, a little bit about Scandinavia, and then we can talk about red versus blue.
Well, let me just say at the outset, if you die in the first 6 months, or you die in the second 6 months, or you die in the third 6 months, or you die in the fourth 6 months, you're still pretty dead. So the question is, what does that mean in terms of protection? It wasn't enough to protect you for 6 months, or 12 months, or 18 months. We needed to get you through the pandemic. And so that was one of the challenges that we had, was also how to help convey that to the public. And it turns out that, for example, in China, this was a classic example, they did do hard lockdowns in many areas where people were not permitted to leave their homes for almost a year, where basically food was brought to them, etc. And I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 2021 saying, wake up world, China's about ready to explode. Why? Because the social pressure got so great that the government could no longer keep all these people basically in what was called, in-home quarantine. And sure enough, they released many of them, but they never vaccinated them. And suddenly, China goes from almost no cases to 20 million cases overnight. Because again, you had to wait through the whole pandemic. And so if you basically did something for the first 6 months, but not after that, you were still as vulnerable. You wasted your 6 months, you did something. And so that was a problem. The second issue is severity of the disease. The United States took the biggest hit in the world. Why? Because we're the most unhealthy population in the world. Let's just acknowledge it. By age, by underlying health conditions, etc. Obesity is another issue. And so part of the problem was we took a heavy hit because we weren't as healthy as many other countries in the world, where the same COVID virus did still extract a toll, but they weren't dying because of it. And I think that that was a real challenge also to help get that across. And then the final piece you said, by 2020, into 2021, 2022, we had really seen a division in this country between red and blue states. And we estimate that there may be as many as 500,000 deaths that occurred in red states versus blue states because of the difference in vaccine uptake. And think of that, that's a lot of people who ideologically largely decided to get vaccinated or not. And again, how do we deal with that for the future? So I think that all the things we've just talked about tonight, put those into a big bucket and realize, wow, this is really a difficult situation.
Yeah. President Chamberlain, if he's gone tonight, but if he were here, he likes to use the phrase, strive to serve the common good. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the countries like Sweden, for example, that had a little different social ethos about how they approach the pandemic, how do you balance that strive to serve the common good with individual freedoms? In the U.S., we emphasize, it's my car, my restaurant, I want to do my thing. How do we balance those two things?
Well, it turns out that ironically, many of the countries that did very well initially, by the time they got done, that 4-6 month period, there were no difference. For example, in the Scandinavian countries,
no difference between Sweden and Norway and
no
Finland?
difference between Sweden and Norway by the time the pandemic finished off.
Was Sweden more open than
they
Norway
were
and
initially, and that resulted in people saying, see, you can do it like this. But then when the Delta and Omicron variants came, this really changed things. And so from an infection standpoint, basically countries really did equal out in the end. This virus will find you.
So the virus didn't pay any attention to borders?
Or social practices if it meant mixing of people.
Yeah, of course. Shifting gears, Mike, you talk a lot about countermeasures. And what can we do to fight the bug, the virus, whatever? There's pharmaceutical measures we'll talk about in a minute, and there's non-pharmaceutical things. So during the early days of the pandemic, there were plexiglass shields going up everywhere. We were told to social distance. Elevators had yellow X's on the floor, told us where to stand so we wouldn't face a different direction, talk to people. Give us just I know it's maybe a silly topic at this point when you talked about smoke from 40 feet away, but all the things we thought about that we thought could be effective countermeasures that were non-pharmaceutical, give us a take on that.
Expensive junk science.
So basically none of that did any good.
Let me just give you an example of an airborne situation, one of the ones I worked up in my career. When I was at the State Health Department, the Special Olympics were held in the Twin Cities. And we were obviously excited about that. Opening night ceremony, there were 64,000 people in the stands, not part of the actual Special Olympics, just there to see the opening night session. And then on the infield, outfield area was all the players and the team coaches and team support people. And they sat there for about 3.5 hours during this ceremony. It turned out that a young boy from Argentina was sitting right on home plate. And the air was blowing out from behind home plate, and it turned out he was just breaking with measles. We had not had measles indigenous in Minnesota in the previous 5 years. And basically, we saw an outbreak occur in the players' teams, but we also had a small group of Minnesotans who had no experience with the Special Olympics except for one thing. They all went to the opening night session. Turned out they all sat in the same section, about the size of that section right there, and they were at 420 feet up from home plate, where Mark McGwire couldn't hit a home run at that time on steroids. And it turned out that the airflow came out from behind home plate, literally bounced, and went and deposited out at the exhale vent up at 420 feet, and these people all sat around it. That's an airborne transmission. And that's the challenge we had. So in many buildings, in many locations, air movement was so sufficient. One of the things we're terrible at in this country is HVAC systems. I mean, do you really know in this room what air you're breathing right now? And how much of it was the air that your neighbor just breathed a second ago? We don't put much attention to that. And we need to do much more to look at healthy air that way. But so from a standpoint of what was done with the plexiglass, that was absolutely useless. Again, I use the old adage, if you could smoke a cigarette and not smell it, maybe it worked. But if you had a cigarette, basically you could immediately smell it, even on the other side of that plexiglass. But it made people feel better. The 6-foot mark, no meaning whatsoever. And that's where I think we let the public down as public health. And it was interesting because the chief science officer for the World Health Organization, when she retired in 2022, on her last day, she gave a press conference, and she said the one thing she regretted more than anything is how WHO blew the respiratory protection discussion and what happened there. So we really do need, if you want to be protected today, you need to use an N95 respirator. What does that mean, N95 respirator? Well, it's a mask. I see some in the audience. Well done. And they're important in the sense that they're made from what's called melt-blown material. It's a material that actually allows air to move in and out. It's porous enough, but it has an electrostatic charge, just like we see on some of the air filters that we see. And so the virus gets trapped. And it also is firm around the face. When's the last time you used swim goggles that leaked in the lens? No, they leak on the side. And so you have to have it tight, and that's, to be tight, then that's why the air passes through this material. That can save your life. We've done the studies, we can show you that if you put a person in a room with somebody who has COVID, and you actually put somebody in there who has an N95 respirator on, they can be in that same room with that person for 24 hours and not transmit the virus, where it would be 15 minutes if that person didn't have a respirator on. So we do have the ability to do this. We just have not educated the public. Now there's one exception, and this is where things got tight again. We have no respirators that are made for children, none. And so one of the problems we had is you could put something on a child's face, but it was useless. And that was a real hard issue, and we've tried hard to get our government and other governments to really pursue this. The research and development needs to be there. We know we can make even better N95s that are more comfortable than the ones we have now, and that's all been shut down. All that work has been shut down, and industry's not taking it on because they don't see a market right now.
You know, Mike, as we talk about the pharmaceutical measures, you touched on vaccines earlier. There was some skepticism because the messenger RNA virus vaccine got up and running pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. If you think it took years to get the polio vaccine developed, how were they able to develop that so rapidly and get it into production?
Well, first of all, let me just put the medical market into some perspective. Next year, we expect the oncology market in this country to be at $500 billion. We expect the immunology market for immune-related diseases to be $300 million. We expect infectious diseases across the board to be about $75 million. And vaccines come in at a lowly $36 billion. Now, if I'm a pharmaceutical official, I'm in management, I'm trying to look at making, good for our company here. I got a board, I got to report to, I have investors. Where are you going to invest your money? It ain't going to be in vaccines right now. And so one of the challenges we're also seeing is the fact that from a pharmaceutical company standpoint, this is not a place to get rich fast with vaccines. And the second thing is that we're having a hard time recruiting people to really even begin to pursue new vaccines and to move with those. And so just to give you the challenge we have today, I still am very involved with influenza work and work a lot with the vaccines. Our group at CIDRAP actually oversees what we call the influenza vaccine roadmap for the world. We keep track of, like air traffic control, every research project that's going on right now with influenza vaccine. And our vaccines for influenza are good, but they're not great. What I mean by that is, in a good seasonal year, you may be able to reduce hospitalizations and deaths by 50 to 60%, which is phenomenal, but it doesn't necessarily prevent you from getting infected or even transmitting the virus to others. We need new, better flu vaccines. But more specifically, if we had a pandemic happen, right now, over 90% of all of our influenza vaccine is grown up in embryonated chicken eggs. Literally, you have to have one egg per one person, because that's how much virus you can get out to make a vaccine dose. A highly, highly labor-intensive, highly vulnerable technology. It would take us at least a year, just to make enough vaccine for 20% of the world if we had a pandemic of influenza tomorrow. On the other hand, if you had an mRNA vaccine, the kind that we talked about where instead of for COVID, it was made for influenza, we could make enough vaccine for the world in less than a year. The difference between those two scenarios is millions and millions and millions of deaths. Our government stopped all research at the NIH on mRNA vaccines for reasons that clearly ideology only, had nothing to do with science. Think what they're taking away from us. And because the United States is basically, the big stick, countries around the world are also pulling back out of mRNA research because they're afraid that somehow it may interfere with their relationship with the United States. And so we're not getting it done. And we need to. And so we need these vaccine investments because they are what's going to get us out. And again, sometimes I don't like myself because I have to listen to what I have to say and it just bugs me. But I have to say, 35% case fatality rate for the next big pandemic, that's a real possibility. Wouldn't you want to have a vaccine that worked pretty good? You asked how the mRNA got done. Ironically, the mRNA vaccine has been in research for more than 20 years. It was being looked at, and it is right now, for certain cancer vaccines. It has very high potential for cancer vaccine. We're looking at it for other infectious agents as such. So that was not something just invented overnight. It was a technology that had been well worked on, and it was fortunate to be able to bring it to the table when we did.
Mike, you sound pretty pessimistic there. We use this term moonshot. We put people around the moon, cost billions of dollars to do that.
Yeah.
You think this idea of using that mRNA chassis to develop a lifetime respiratory immunity, is that just with something that's highly effective, lifetime immunity, like a measles vaccine, is that just out of reach with current science technology?
Kind of. And let me just say that, very fortunately, some diseases like measles the virus changes so very, very little that you can get lifetime protection out of being vaccinated or having had measles, okay? For other viruses, you all know this with flu because you're encouraged to get your flu shot every year, okay? They change, and they change enough so that you have to get a new hit to basically boost that immune system as such. Right now, we don't have any technology that gives us lifelong protection for coronaviruses or flu. We're working on that. That's the very thing that we're working on, is trying to look at what are the mechanisms. For example, take the flu vaccine. What that vaccine attacks is one part of the flu virus that's constantly changing. It's a part of, it's like a stick in the cell. And so when that changes, you have to change the vaccine. But there are particles inside of the flu virus that are constant. And we're now working on efforts to actually develop immunity to those constant pieces. And if we could, then we might actually get further along with the flu vaccine. But right now, we have to just settle for the fact that we need a vaccine quickly, and one that can be effective, at least in the short term, for flu and coronaviruses. Those two alone would be really a major breakthrough.
Okay. Mike, you're leading the efforts in the Vaccine Integrity Project. Can you wrap that around what you just said, or is that kind of a different effort?
Wow. On the night of the election, when I realized that Mr. Trump had won, I knew right away that Mr. Kennedy would play a very senior role because the Maha group had delivered a whole group of voters. And so we anticipated that. I went back and read the 2025 document from the Heritage Foundation. And I'm telling you right there, the next morning I sent an email to our staff, and I'm getting to be an old man and people are ready to move me out, to pasture. I said, I'm here for 4 more years at least. And the only thing I could think of was my kids and grandkids. I'm here. And everything that I worried about I put into an article that was published in the New York Times, an op-ed piece about 2 weeks after the election, and said, America, wake up. This man's going to try to take your vaccines away from you. And I could go through a whole litany of things that have happened so far, which have been as anti-science and have been just outright lies about the science of these vaccines. And they're damaging, they're deadly. Taking vaccines away from pregnant women when we know you can greatly reduce the hospitalization and deaths in pregnant women from COVID. Taking flu vaccines away. Taking hepatitis B vaccine away from newborns who are born to mothers who are hepatitis B positive, et cetera. So we've had a whole series of those things. Well, in prior to Trump, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, is a group of experts from outside the government that advises CDC on vaccines. And so when a vaccine comes to them for consideration after the FDA has approved it, how it gets used is determined by the ACIP. Well, Mr. Kennedy fired the entire ACIP and put his own largely anti-vaccine people in. And they immediately went to work chewing all of this up. And there was no way for the country to understand what was happening with vaccines like they do with ACIP, where they had work groups that would go into depth on evidence about vaccines and how to do them, and then come out with summaries that then could be used for making recommendations. And just to give you an idea how complex this is, we are doing this now, but one vaccine that we're looking at, Gardasil, or for HPV, in a period of 18 months, it turns out that there were 5,700 different articles published, of which we'd have to go through and digest every one of them and put them together. And so what our center did at CIDRAP is started the Vaccine Integrity Project. We're now doing what ACIP did. We have work groups. We're putting out the evidence for each vaccine. We've been able to work with the AMA to then coordinate with all the medical societies. And so now ACIP is not making recommendations, but the medical societies are. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, obviously for kids, ACOG for pregnant women, et cetera. And we've now become de facto what the ACIP was. And we now are handing that to these groups. In addition to that, there has always been a lot of interchange between the companies that make vaccines and do research on them and the work groups for the ACIP. That's gone. We started a situation here with our efforts where companies come to us. We have then NDAs signed, non-disclosure agreements, and then we contact the appropriate medical societies. We get them on one Zoom, and then we jump off. And that gets around any of the business collusion issues, et cetera. And now we've got that going. And so we've tried to fill in the best we can. And I think the one thing that is an important message to leave here is we were told a year ago, you can't do this. Nobody can do this. Damn it, we're doing it. And I think it's really... Thank you. It's really important to not give up or give in. And the motto at our center is, we will bend and we will bend, but we will not break. And I think that if I could give you any sense tonight, there's so much we still can do. And you ask yourself out there, how many are aware of the group called Grandparents for Vaccines? They're amazing. They're incredible. It's on our website. You can go to them. Get involved. Be part of this. And we're taking it on to them right now. We're taking it head on to the administration. And right now, I think, for us, laugh about it, we're winning. And it just gives us all hope that we can do things like this.
Mike, in your book, the big one, talking about what might be ahead of us, you talk about where we are with surveillance and our lack of having a good surveillance mechanism. Other countries do it better, like the UK. To use the analogy of the weather system, the National Weather Service, they put up all these balloons and they know the temperature of the barometer. They can tell you if it's going to snow or rain next Tuesday. We don't know what's going to happen with viruses and mutations and things. We don't know who's going to be infected and how many. What type of database, what type of national system would you wish we could implement de-identified information, for example, a national system? What do we need to have that surveillance mechanism where your team can use that data to help not only predict what's going to happen, but also to protect all of us?
Yeah.
What do you need?
Well, first of all, any system collect information in this country is coming from an unfortunately far too often dysfunctional healthcare system. And so there isn't one smooth reporting site or a way for us to collect information. If you're in the Mayo Clinic, you have an amazing system for your Mayo Clinic patients and for Olmsted County, but there are a lot of places in the country that don't have that. And so one of the things that we have really stressed, and we talk about that at great length in the book, is that kind of intelligence of knowing what's happening out there, of picking up things quickly and being able to respond, often makes the difference between is this going to be a very large outbreak, not a pandemic, but a large outbreak versus a small outbreak. I can't tell you how many times this Minnesota Department of Health, a pride of the whole country in terms of health departments, has picked up very early on foodborne outbreaks of massive quantities of food that people aren't picking up, potentially thousands and thousands of cases, and they pick it up because of a lab-based surveillance we have in Minnesota, which isn't everywhere. And so picking this stuff up can be really helpful because we get that food product off the market, and rather than have to treat people, and it just doesn't happen. So surveillance is very, very important. The problem with surveillance is the word. This comes from basically the 1950s. And when people hear the word surveillance, it tends to conjure up, intelligence, CIA. Unfortunately, I even heard it used with ICE in Minneapolis, St. Paul over the winter. And so we need to come up with a better way to say, how do we collect this information so it is not risking your identity, your privacy, but it allows us to collect the information like the Weather Service does in a sense to do this. And we surely need to do that better. Can I just add one last piece?
Of course.
Anybody read the paper last week? You saw that the CDC is not doing rabies testing anymore, or for a number of other viruses. Again, they have one person right now that's left at CDC that knows how to do rabies work. Okay, think of that. I mean, they were all doged. That's the challenge we have right now.
Mike, you all these challenges with government, academia, industry, low margins on new drugs. Do you have an optimistic tone about how we can collaborate, how we can work together? We look at countries like the UK that has kind of a national database. Their surveillance is better. We've got phenomenal scientists and pharmaceutical industry people, but we don't seem to be able to put it all together. We don't communicate well. We don't have the right surveillance together. How do we put this package together to kind of protect us for the future? If you look at the military example, they're building aircraft carriers for 10 years from now because there might be a war between China and Taiwan. What are we doing to prepare for this big wave that's going to hit us someday? What do we need to get everyone on the same page? What do we need to do?
Well, first of all, we are very much penny wise, pound foolish, as you just pointed out, even within the military. I'm no expert on military spending. Okay, let me be really clear on that. So this is my personal opinion. But go look at Pete Peterson's foundation site, and you'll see that the United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries of the world combined. That's China and Russia included. Now we're talking about adding another $500 billion to that, okay? When you look at what we're doing in de-investing in the kind of research, infectious disease research, and the kind of infrastructure support you're talking about, it's just going the opposite way. I sit on pins and needles here. In Minnesota, 94% of the state budget for infectious disease control, surveillance and control, are federal dollars that are highly vulnerable, highly vulnerable. We could see Minnesota become a desert for information potentially in the future because of this very issue. So I think we have to go back and ask ourselves, what is it that really kills us, that really causes us to have such pain, and what can we do about it? And I think that discussion is obviously really important. For me, it comes down to one thing. Obviously, I've been in this business 50-some years, and I'm going to stay in it, but I have a 10 by 14 inch electronic picture frame on my desk. And every 30 seconds, a new picture comes by of my grandkids. I never need to ask myself why I can't ever give up, ever give up. It's in that picture frame.
That's what you're working for, that next generation. Yeah. Well, Mike, you've laid the groundwork for us to be very concerned about where we're at right now as a public health situation. You know, you kind of gave us pretty high marks for the 20th century. You know, some remarkable things happen. Your grade right now for the public health system, I don't think it'd be an A+. I think it might be down there a few notches. And you've kind of given us some strong suggestions that we need to think about investments and priorities, and certainly you've given us a strong message that leadership matters a lot. Who's in government, who's elected to the CDC, the World Health Organization, funding for NIH, these are critical things. So I think you've given us a recipe, acknowledging that we are well in crisis right now. We need to get our heads together, but you've kind of given us a recipe for how we can think about moving forward with this. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I'm going to ask you two last questions. You've been asked questions all over the planet by everyone who does this, every question, but you've never gotten these two questions before. So here goes. You've had a remarkable career, and these last 6 years, I'm sure, have been very challenging, both for you personally, professionally, your family, as you highlighted, etc. What can you take away from your relationship with Dr. David Roslien that has helped you navigate these last 6 years? And the second part of the question, what can you take away from your Luther College liberal arts education that has, this wasn't planted by Dr. Chamberlain. What can you, but seriously, there's a lot of students sitting in front here. What Dr. Roslien's guidance during your 50 years of relationship with him and also your liberal arts education, what can you take away from that that's helped you navigate these last 6 really challenging years? We'll conclude with that and open it up to the floor, but anxious to hear what you say.
Wow. You're right. No one's ever asked me those questions before. Well, Doc and Joy, you know that you've had everything to do with my life. I've mentored over 250 graduate students, which ironically, Luther has a very favored pipeline to our program at Minnesota. And Doc, the only thing Doc's ever asked of me is just pay it forward. And so I'd like to think that the most wonderful thing is the fact that long after both Doc and I are gone, Doc Rosen will still be flowing through the blood of a lot of people. And I think that, to me, is probably the most important lesson I've learned, is just to pay it forward. Luther, I think, is a place where, like many colleges considered liberal arts education institutions, has been misunderstood as being that liberal institution. I think of Luther as a Renaissance science. I think of Luther as a place where, you know, I might pick a graduate student who has a straw size opening that goes down 20 miles versus someone who basically has a understanding of, like, the Oneota Valley, wide, deep. And that kind of liberal arts education can't be understated or overstated. I think about when I was a senior in college here, I got a mail note one day in my box, you know, this is before internet, from Jim Rhodes, head of political science, and he wanted to see me right away. So I go over to see Jim, and, you know, hello, you know, Professor Rhodes, yes? And he was not happy with me. I was the only student that hadn't filled out their Plan B forms for their senior paper. And I looked at him and I said, well, why would I do that? And then he got kind of even more upset with me. And then I realized we were miscommunicating because I was a biology major. He said, well, no, you have enough credit for a political science major. And I got a double major by accident. But I'm not so sure that accidental part wasn't some of the most important education I've had in my life. It's learning how to get things done. It's learning how to deal with power or lack thereof. It's learning how to plan. And that's what Luther does. It opens your eyes. And that's why I love Luther graduate students, because they come in with a wide open Renaissance perspective generally. And I think that's an invaluable gift. You won't necessarily realize it right now, but one day you will. You'll come back and you'll understand, wow, that's what I learned. And just remember, most of what we learn right now is going to be obsolete in 3 years. The most important thing you have to do is figure out how to learn how to learn. And that's, again, what Luther teaches us. It teaches us how to learn. Because then when you have to replace that old, no longer helpful information with the current, you know how to do it.
Mike, that's exactly the answer I thought you might share. All right. We've only got about 16 minutes before it's 8:30, so we invite you to come to the microphone. This is your chance to ask Mike Osterholm any of your questions. I see people coming down. Fabulous. Don't be shy. We want to hear what's on your mind when it comes to all things infectious disease, pandemic, COVID. Don't ask about those cloth masks over your face, because Mike's got a snarky answer for that one. Yes, ma'am.
All right. So you've discussed a lot how the government has treated diseases and how they should be planning to stop them in the future. But how can we, as the individual, fight that ourselves? If our government isn't doing its job now, so how can we try to make up for what they're lacking?
Very, very, very important question. First of all, have the attitude you want to, okay? Second of all is determine what it is that you think you can do. For example, I mentioned the vaccine area. You know, there is a lot of need right now for community-based education on vaccines and to become more informed and to actually serve almost in buddy programs to help get good information out. Those organizations are available. They're looking for volunteers. So do something like that. Get involved. You know, I have stayed free of the politics so that I can call balls and strikes, but I'm not suggesting you have to. Get involved. You know, understand what elections mean and how they can impact what's happening. And so, you know, get involved. Now, for some of you in this room, I have to say this may not ring true, but I was here in the fall of 1971 when Luther got shut down before the end of the semester over the students taking over Maine and the issues. And by God, they had a cause, and they did it. Please, students, do not ever underestimate your power. Do not. That would be a real mistake.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
In retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, what should we have done between February 2020 and the vaccine?
Well, actually, I had something very specific. When we talked about lockdowns, you know, the idea that we were going to shut everything down, 41 states did some kind of a lockdown, which if it was like Minnesota's, for example, non-essential workers were not allowed to go to work, okay? Problem was 82% of our workforce was deemed essential. So, I mean, that really wasn't a lockdown, okay? And knowing that this was going to continue, it was going to be like a hurricane, bad, and then we're going to get into... And so, what did we have in those first months of the pandemic? We had good medical care. So we didn't have anything to treat you with specifically as a drug for COVID, but if we could keep you alive, we could keep those lungs breathing, we could keep you from basically going into a whole series of cascading health crises. That was the gift. But if your hospital is running 140, 150% capacity, you got patients in beds and hallways, you got patients in garage stalls, locations, that's not going to provide that kind of care. So what we had proposed, and I said at the time, we should go to snow days. Snow day, what? What if every hospital had to report out every morning their bed census? This is how many beds are filled, this is how many beds are empty. And you say to the public, you're at 120% capacity? Boy, this is not a good time to get COVID, is it? And let the public realize what the challenges would be in public events, schools, whatever. At least they had the information to know. And now my community got back down to 85 or 90%. That would then give you another answer of what your behavior might be. And so it wasn't you couldn't do anything. It was the fact that you were trying to preserve the best medical care possibilities you could. And that's what I would have done through that entire time.
Thank you.
Mike, we've got a great cue on both mics. We'll go rapid
Fast.
fire. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I'm not good at being quick, sorry.
Oh, me neither. So this might be a little niche, but I just did a research project in my Paideia class about the impact of Spanish influenza at Luther College. Is there anything that, is a parallel between that and COVID that we didn't talk about?
Well, I think I did talk about COVID and the pandemic influenza issue of what happened after the pandemic, but there were very similar situations where, again, people became seriously ill. We did see more with 1918 pandemic, much younger people who were getting sick, particularly young adults. And that was potentially unique for the flu. But otherwise, I think similarity-wise, from a social political standpoint, unfortunately, there were many similar traits that happened.
And a little bit about the impact of World War I, what did that have?
What's that? I'm sorry.
What did the impact of World War I do for the flu?
The impact of World War I.
Yeah.
Was there an
influenza.
intersectionality?
Well, if you want to have a real impact, go to France and see that in the graves there, many, many more soldiers are buried in France dying from influenza than died from battle. That should tell you something right there.
Thank you.
Mike, just to follow up on that, you talked earlier about the importance of leadership. During World War I, Woodrow Wilson was the U.S. president. He was very preoccupied with the war in Europe. Mike, tell him what happened. What did Woodrow Wilson not talk about?
He wouldn't talk about the pandemic at all. We had whole cities like that. Philadelphia, cities where it almost was forbidden to talk about the pandemic.
Yeah.
So our president refused to kind of highlight how serious a matter this was during a critical time.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Kopo, and I'm a senior here at Luther. I'm a biology and global health double major. And in my global health class this semester, my senior seminar, we've been talking a lot about cost effectiveness. And you mentioned a little bit about the different industries. And I was just wondering, a question that I've had this entire semester is, how do we balance people's needs for making profit with still making vaccines and drugs affordable for people?
Balance the concern about making profits versus making drugs that are effective for people.
Well, again, let me come back to the fact that right now, if you're talking about a profit margin, vaccines are the last place you want to be in for pharmaceutical industries. We're very concerned. There are 5 companies that currently make childhood vaccines in this country, and they have their own individual vaccines, so it's not like they all make all the kinds of vaccines, okay? We have every reason to believe that those 5 could drop out of the business if there are certain things that happen with the injury compensation law that exists in place right now, where if autism is added to that, we know that the injury compensation program will go bankrupt. If that happens, the 5 companies will pull out. We will not have a vaccine in the United States for a child. We literally will be at that level. That's one of the things we're fighting right now, is to make sure that that doesn't happen, but that's a real challenge. So we need the industry from the vaccine standpoint very badly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Osterholm,
Mike.
some years before COVID, I heard you talking about your concern of what might happen if the bird flu jumped from pigs to people.
Yeah.
Scared me so much, I ran out and bought those N95 masks and surgical gloves, which was very good that I had for COVID.
You know what we say about that? I scared you into your wits, not out of your wits. Okay.
So anyway, do I still need to worry about what might happen if this virus, bird flu, jumps?
Keep them. I don't know when I have a cabinet full. I don't know. We don't know. I mean, tomorrow, for all I know, right now, as I'm talking to you, something's happening around the world that I wish I knew more about.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll still keep the respirators and the gloves.
Yeah, keep them. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for taking your time to be here with us tonight. I know you emphasized remaining nonpartisan in your work throughout different administrations. My question is, what role does partisanship have in public trust in vaccinations and public health, and how can future leaders in the field remain confident and steadfast in a world that is rapidly losing trust in public health?
Well, partisanship obviously is very critical because it decides what legislation gets passed or what gets signed into law. I think, if anything, my time in government proved to me that government can function. It can be a better good and not a lesser evil. I saw this with 9/11. You know, I was there to help for 3 years. I split my time between Minnesota and HHS for 3 years after 9/11. And I was there for the process of bringing forward the 9/11 Commission, which was chaired by a Republican and a Democrat. It was never partisan, and it was hard-hitting. And that document is remarkable in what it did to lay out all the things we could have and should have known, or at least once we did, what we could do about them. And it was a remarkable effort that was bipartisan. All the different governors I worked for, all the different parties, I saw high levels of effective partisanship work, meaning bringing different people together. And I think I still have that dream that that can be done. And so don't give up on that. You know, again, for those students in this room, oh, we need you. We need you badly. And I'm so sorry that my generation is handing this world over to you in such a defeated, damaged condition. Don't give up. So partisan or nonpartisan, stay the course.
Thank you.
Please.
You discussed the impact of the Luther liberal arts education, but what specific opportunities from your time at Luther set you up for where you are in your career today?
I don't know if I can talk about it. Well, you know, in fact, one of my colleagues is here. I spent a lot of time in my time at Luther doing cave diving, going into all these springs and almost killing ourselves. I don't know what was wrong with us to do that. So I think one of the things I learned at Luther is the power of paying it forward. There was a faculty that was here, and Doc Shirley was at the lead for me, but there were many faculty people here who basically invested themselves in the students, and it wasn't for just a paycheck. It was for the future. And so I think that same way. It's not too early for you to think about what your legacy is going to be. I said this afternoon, I met with a group of students, tonight I want you to go to bed, and before you fall asleep, identify for yourself what is the things that you value most in life, and how are you going to make sure that those are something that you're a part of years from now. Think about have you ever thought about what you value most? So I think the students with the faculty together here explore these things. And you know, don't give up. Never give up.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Uwe.
Hi, I hate to throw you a curveball. You use a lot of baseball analogies, calling balls and strikes. Those are currently being called by AI in some cases in the National League, and I'm wondering what AI is doing for your research. And before I forget, I want to say, all you young people, inform yourselves and get involved to vote. That's a change you can make.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you. I don't know what AI is going to do. I must tell you that we all are trying to understand that. It's going to change the world, but how, I don't know. And so we're looking at that very carefully right now. And if I had a better answer, I'd tell you than to say it's real. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Hello. So thank you for all the very important work you do. And with that, I was wondering, how do you maintain a work-life balance?
Who put you up to that?
Where's Mike's wife? She can answer that.
Yeah, she's back there.
Where are you, Fern?
Yeah. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. There's no rest, you know. And since we took on the Integrity Project, the Vaccine Integrity Project has only made things more complicated. But, you know, when you're a fireman at a fire, you don't get to go and say, I'm going to take a coffee break, I'll be back in half an hour. And unfortunately, we just have had a lot of concurrent fires. So, you know, I do appreciate the balance is so important. It's very important. I don't always do such a good job at it. I will acknowledge that. And I may have all my excuses that I think it's because I'm doing something good, but it's an important point. And if nothing else, I would say it again to the students, don't necessarily do what I've done, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Osterholm, Tyler Menke, I'm a family practice doc here in town. You talked a lot about things that are scary, and also people have been talking about becoming involved. Where can people go now for good information when we're inundated on social media and in conversations with family members with misinformation, disinformation, where they can feel empowered to have those conversations?
Well, this sounds very potentially biased. Our website is by far the best in the country.
That's the truth. I need everybody to know Dr. Osterholm is doing all of the work of the federal government in immunizations. And
thank you.
No, this Elise is here for our travel clinic nursing. When we do all our immunizations, we look at the CDC, but now we're going to the British websites and other ones because we can't trust the information, and you're doing that.
You're
so
right.
Thank you.
Well, one of the other things we're doing is the CDC publishes a piece called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which has historically been where health departments publish information updated. And that has been taken over by the political leaders of the CDC, and basically they're withholding articles that should come out, they're editing articles that politicize them, et cetera. So we started with the New England Journal of Medicine, CIDRAP did, a thing called Public Health Alerts. And now we're doing the same thing, and we're beginning to get a major increase in people submitting to us. It's free of charge, and it's like the MMWR. I might also add, one of the things that has been a real stickler with me, and maybe it's because I remember being very poor, but the fact is that today so much of the information that you have access to is behind a paywall. And I think that's just wrong. We need to have a way for everyone to have access to the best information. So we promise you this, I promise you this, CIDRAP will never, ever have a penny charge on anything that we ever put out.
Please.
Hi, I just want to say I'm also from Waukon, so I love that. But I'm curious, say the government were to put a mandation for vaccinations in order to board a plane right now, do you think that would help infectious disease spread?
By putting a mandate on vaccines?
In order to board a plane.
Yeah. You know, one of the challenges we have is why do people do or not do things? And oftentimes just making them a mandatory activity doesn't, in fact, encourage vaccination. It drives people away. And so one of the things we're trying to understand and learn is how do you help bring people together to consensus to say, I want to do this. And I think the vaccine mandate, and I talk about that in the book a lot, was a mistake in the COVID pandemic. And you know, for vaccines like measles, where you have high-level protection, you stop transmission so you don't transmit it to anybody else, you have lifelong protection, that's an easy one to mandate. When you have a vaccine that you need to get 2 to 3 times a year just to stay current, and it doesn't have a lot of the characteristics that you'd like to have, people still get very sick, et cetera, I think that's a real hard one to mandate. So I think this is where we need to have a healthy discussion about how we talk to the public about these vaccines.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got time we're supposed to wrap up at 8:30. Andy, can we go a couple more minutes and let these 3 gentlemen ask their question? He gave us the thumb up. Yes, sir.
I've been reading your book. Thank you for writing it. It's an important one. But I have a question. Why hasn't the CDC or somebody with the study of the coronavirus and stuff, why don't they recommend a mouthwash?
Well, we have looked at a lot of different kinds of therapies, and no data that I am aware of supports mouthwashes make a difference. I've seen people report it, but not the data. We've seen that with a lot of drugs, like ivermectin, things like that. And so I think one of the challenges we have is making sure that the information we put out is based on good scientific evidence. And again, I'm sorry to say, I wish there was a mouthwash that was effective. I haven't seen one. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I thank you very much for coming here and speaking to a small audience, preaching to the choir here. Are you going to take this particular thing? Do you have a film of this? Could this be transmitted and sent to larger choirs or places where there isn't a choir but needs to hear the story?
I'd have to say Luther would have to decide that, but you know, I'm happy to have whatever I said tonight. I realize anytime I say one word in public, it's public. So, you know, I stand behind everything I said tonight and be happy to reiterate it, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your compliment. Yeah.
Sir, you have the last word.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you once again, since I think I'm the last one.
Thank you.
So this is kind of a two-part question. I know you had mentioned funding and in the United States, where that goes and consequently how that can affect even the funding of other countries, where they put their money.
Yeah.
So kind of a two-part. What do you think will be the most dangerous aspect of an upcoming and inevitable pandemic, whether that be media coverage, social denial, government and public policy, pharmaceutical issues, or something different? And then how can we prepare public policy and healthcare systems for something that doesn't quite yet exist?
Well, first of all, great list, okay? You're hired. Second of all of the above. We don't have a choice of just fixing one thing or another. You've got to fix the whole situation. You know, you can have the best vaccine in the world, and if it doesn't go into somebody's arm, it's useless. It's a failure. And so all aspects of this have to be really laid out. So I think all of it. So thank you.
Thank you for coming out tonight.
Can I make one comment?
Of course.
You know, just to see you all still here yet. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but it's really very true tonight. I remember so very, very well an interview that Harry Chapin did with Pete Seeger. Harry Chapin, the great balladeer who died in the 1970s in a car crash. Pete Seeger, who of course was the anti-Vietnam War leader, a very important singer in our country. And Harry said to Pete one day, he said, "Pete, why do you do that? Does it really make any difference?" And Pete looked at Harry and he said, "You know, Harry, I don't know. But I know that when I go to bed at night and my head hits that pillow, I spent the day with the really good people. And you know what? Tonight, I know I spent time with the really good people." Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And Mike has graciously said he's going to go out to the lobby and spend a few moments for people who want to come up to Mike and ask your questions. So thank you again for coming tonight.